I think so.
Welcome, everyone. Good to see so many of us here. Glad you could make it tonight. We have a couple of quick announcements before we begin. There are sign-up sheets which will be available outside the room here on a table after the event. Also a QR code that you could scan for chapel credit. We're trying to have one station on either side of the room. As you exit, you just scan those. But before I introduce our speaker, our dean, Dr. Luke Fetters, has agreed to open us with prayer. Dr. Feather?
Okay, that's just plain silly. Okay. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you for revealing something of yourself to us in your word, in your creation, and in your image that we recognize in each other. There is so much more to you than we can know or even pretend to know, and yet you invite us to continue to explore. Thank you for Dr. Beall, for his mind, for his disciplined study, and for what he has prepared to share with us this evening about his understanding of important truths about our Savior, Jesus Christ. Guide our minds to help us attend, guide our hearts to help us discern. Bless our thoughts as we turn them toward you. Amen.
Our speaker tonight is Dr. J.C. Beall, the O'Neill Family Chair of Philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. Now, first of all, with J.C. as initials, I think there'll be no surprise who he came here to talk to us about. Bet you never heard that one before. But in all seriousness, Professor Beall is a philosopher, not a pastor. One of the things we love about him sharing his scholarly efforts with us this evening is that he provides a powerful example of how one can use their gifts, in his case, philosophy, in your case, likely something else, to probe and deepen our understanding of our faith. We're privileged to be able to hear him speak about some of his recent work from his 2021 book, The Contradictory Christ. That title should grab your attention. I'll let the expert fill you in on the details. Dr. Beall?
Thank you. So thank you for having me. It's a delight. It's my first time in Huntington, and I got to know some of the students who are in an intro philosophy class today. And to them, I'm tempted to give a quiz, but I'll be going over some of the things that we talked about. So most of my work has been in the field of logic and the philosophy of logic. So I spent a large part of my career so far doing that. And some of the lessons that I learned in that field applies directly to some of the issues in theology. And you don't have to be a theologian, I think, to be aware of some of the issues that I'll talk about. But I'm going to start. I should also say I'm only going to go maybe 35, 40 minutes because I'm more interested in sort of Q&A than I am in just lecturing. A lot of the good stuff comes out in Q&A anyhow. Okay, so there are going to be two big parts to this talk. The first part is going to be just some logic. And I know that that's exciting. So it's going to be logic first. And then after that, I'll turn to what Dr. Drury was talking about, an application of our understanding of logic to some fundamental problems in theology. Okay. So logic, whether you've taken logic or you haven't, logic is usually called classical logic. Okay, this is the sort of main standard story about logic. But what does logic concern? Well, logic concerns very elementary bits of our language called the logical vocabulary. It concerns things like or, either this or that. concerns things like and, this and that. It can concern things like if this, then that. But at the very bottom of all of it, it has two little connectives called a truth and falsity connective. And ultimately, actually, people at the front probably can't see this, right? So ultimately, let me pull this up, and if this goes into your lap, just hand it back. Oh boy, this is tough. Okay, I'll tell you what. I'll just sort of write and walk, all right? At bottom, logic has two fundamental properties it talks about, truth and falsity. Okay? So there's truth and falsity. Now, on the standard story, classical logic, every single sentence in our language, when logicians talk about sentences, all they mean are declarative sentences, ones that declare something about reality. Not talking about questions or exclamations, just things like, there's a cat on the mat, or there are students in seats, or there's a horse running around in the balcony, okay? Sentences that declare things about the world. According to the standard story, every sentence has this property, or it has this property, and never both, okay? But I want you, probably for the first time in your life, to step back and think just for a minute. Don't think about a particular sentence, like the cat is on the mat or anything like that. Just imagine that we've got a sentence here. You can't see this, can you? Okay. Imagine that you've got a sentence here, sentence A, all right? Could be anything. The cat is on the mat. Huntington won this sporting event, whatever, okay? Anything you want. Arbitrary sentence A. Now, you have two properties here, right? Think about this. When you have two properties, or you can even think of, two properties. How many possibilities are there in the abstract? I want you to think. Come up with your answer. I'm not gonna wait for somebody to say it, but I do want you to think for a moment. And everyone can see this? Yeah? Okay. If you have two properties for a given object, a sentence, there are four possibilities, right? Raise your hand if you came up with four, just out of curiosity. 3 people. No. Raise your hand if you came up with 2. Yeah, that's usually the norm. Anyone come up with 3? 1 person? Yeah, okay. Oh, 2. Mathematician. I think that the answer is 4. Here's why. This sentence could be related to truth and to nothing else. That is, it could have the property truth, nothing else. Or it could be related to falsity and nothing else. Or, at least in the abstract, it could be related to neither of them. In the abstract, mind you. And of course, in the abstract, it could be related to both. Right? So again, just in the abstract, you could have, with 2 properties, you've got truth You've got falsity. You could have a sentence A just in there. You can see from, okay. Sentence A just in there. A sentence A just in there. A sentence A in the gap between them. Or you could have a sentence A in the intersection. It would have both properties. Does this make sense? I mean, just in the abstract, you have four possibilities, right? You got two properties. Okay. Now, on the standard account of logic, these two possibilities, this in this region and out here, are ignored. They're completely ignored. A sentence out here, it's neither here nor there, is called a gap. So gaps are out here. And a sentence in there would be a glut. It would be a glut of truth values. It would have both. And a gap would have neither. It would sort of be the empty case. Okay? On the standard story of logic, the only two possibilities are you're just in the truth, you're just in the falsity, and you've got to be in exactly one or the other. It turns out that that account of logic is correct as far as it goes, but it's a restriction. Historically, what we know as classical logic was written by mathematicians. Bertrand Russell, Alfred Whitehead, Gottlieb Frege. What were they doing? Well, they were trying to describe logical vocabulary as it occurs in true mathematical theories. They weren't trying to give an account of how logical vocabulary works in all true theories, no matter what part of reality you're talking about. They were just focused on how it behaves in mathematical theories. Once you get outside of mathematics, things start to look a little bit different. So an example that some of your student classmates we talked about earlier today, consider this. So suppose your name is A, okay? Oh, and by the way, logicians have this weird, they write things backwards. So let this be the predicate is a child, okay? And then A is the name, and it somehow goes out front. For each of you, let T0 be when you were born, okay? The predicate child was certainly true of you at T0, right? Yes? Let T1 be a nanosecond after that. 1 nanosecond. That's pretty fast. You're still a child, right? Still true. And then a nanosecond after that, you're still a child. And so on. But we get to here tonight, and of course, and this is just the falsity symbol, it's false that you're a child. Not one of you is a child. I mean, you might say, oh, I'm childlike, I have the heart of a child, I've got that, all good, very good. But literally, right? I mean, it's false that you're a child, and that's of each and every one of you. If every sentence, including you are a child, has to be either just true or just false, then that entails that there was a point at which it went from being true that you're a child to false. So without loss of generality, let's just pretend that it was right here. It doesn't have to be just 1 nanosecond made the difference from you being a child to it being false that you're a child. Raise your hand if you think that that's the way the predicate is a child works. It really works. Does anyone think that? No. What does that mean? That means that there is a point where that's incorrect, right? You're a child at t(n-1) or whatever. It's got to be gappy. Somewhere in here, it has to be gappy that you're a child. If 1 nanosecond doesn't make a difference from going, it's true that you're a child, it's false that you're a child, then this claim that you're a child has to be neither true nor false at some point. Do people get that? Well, is a child is a very common predicate in the language. Consider mountains. Again, sorry to all the students, we talked about this earlier. Suppose that we're all at the top of a mountain, okay? It's true that here is a mountain. Then we take 1 step down. It's true, here's a mountain. Take 1 step down, here's a mountain. And we keep going. Eventually, once things sort of iron out, there's going to become a point where you're no longer at the mountain, but then if the classical account is right, there has to be a sort of millimeter where you went from mountain to it being false that you're on the mountain. Just like the predicate child, language doesn't work that way. And if you have any doubts, ask yourself this question. Why do legal courts have to stipulate the definition of child? I mean, maybe you haven't thought of that, right? Or adult. Why do courts have to give a definition of that? Your answer, if given enough time to think about it, is probably, well, because they need something that applies either in all cases or it doesn't apply. Legal courts don't even use the word child. Legal courts use star child. What's a star child? Well, maybe, are there any legal scholars in here? A star child is, I don't know, does anyone know the age of, it's like, let's say 16, 17? I don't know what it is. Okay, according to legal courts, you're a child until you reach this age, and then you're no longer a child. So a nanosecond after you go past such and so age, you're no longer a child. Well, that's fine. I mean, they have to decide all cases. But the language we speak isn't like that. Okay, you might be now wondering, well, so what? Well, already, just from ordinary language, you have an example of why the standard account of logic is restricted. There's a lot of so-called vague predicates in the language. These predicates involve gaps. There are cases, there are objects of which they are neither true nor false. Child, mountain, you can pick anything really. I mean, so much language is vague like this. So already we've got at least 3 categories. I forget who Three categories: true, gap, false. What about in here? What about gluts? Are there any obvious examples? I think that there are. So consider this. You can see this, right? Okay. So consider the ticked sentence on the board, right? Everyone can see it? There is a sentence on the board. It's ticked. You might call it checked or whatever. And what does it say? Well, it says of itself that it's false. So now, think about the standard account, right? That every sentence in the language has to be either true or false. Well, if this is true, then what it says is the case, right? Well, what it says is that it's false. So if it's true, then it's false. So you might say, okay, then it's false. But hold on, if it's false, I mean, it's speaking truly. So if it's either true or false, it's both. So it's going to be a glut of truth values. Now you might say, excited about all this logic, well, didn't we just learn about gaps? So why not just say it's neither true nor false? Good question. There's a cousin of this sentence, which I'll give you, not to dwell on it, but just to quickly address it. So now look, can everyone see this? I keep thinking, no, you can't? Somebody can't? You can't. Okay. How about that? Can you see it now? All right, let's test it. Read it. No, I'm just kidding. All right. So if we say that this is a gap, right? It's neither true nor false. It's gappy. Okay, then you don't have to say this is an example of a glut. It's not both true and false. But now consider this one. The starred sentence is either false or it's gappy. Well, what do you say about this? If you say it's true, then it's either false or it's gappy. That'll be a contradiction. If you say it's false, then the way disjunctions work, it's going to be true and false. If you say it's gappy, well, that's what it says. It says I'm either gappy or I'm false. So if it's gappy, it's either gappy or it's false. Okay, so eventually you're going to find things in the language that are going to be in this area. Can you still see? Okay. All right. So quick rehearsal. What the standard account of logic is actually a restriction, one that applies only to those portions of reality where the full truth about it involves no contradictions and no gaps. Mathematics is a pristine example of this. Maybe a lot of physics, maybe a lot of biology, and so on. So there's nothing we're not rejecting the standard account as far as it goes. We're just rejecting it as the full account. It's a restriction. That's all it is. All right. Sorry to disappoint you, but that's the end of the logic lesson. Okay, so we'll turn with, I'll try to do this in 12 minutes. Okay? All of that stuff is independent of theology and other things, okay? Even if we think that the truth about these weird sentences or vagueness, even if we think that the truth of that doesn't actually involve gaps or gluts, you can see why those are possibilities. They're just ruled out given some phenomena. Okay. I want to turn to the standard account of the incarnation. So, as you may have learned in a theology class or before that or whatever, the standard account of the incarnation is that Christ is one person, exactly one. And Christ is divine, and this usage of divine is not like superhuman or anything. This is literally, you're divine just when you're God, okay? So one person, you're God, but also human. Not kind of human, not sort of human, not like humanoid or anything like this, literally human. Just like you, just like me. Not in a way of like, you should feel better because Jesus went through what you did. No, this is literally, Jesus was human, period. And Jesus was divine, period. Now, many people, Christians, non-Christians, have the same response to this account. They share a response, which is, this is contradictory. Remember that the God of Christian theology is the God of Jewish theology and the God of Islam. The difference is that Muslims and Jews say, well, Jesus might have been important, but it's not only blasphemous to say that Jesus was God, it's literally contradictory. God is limitless. Humans are essentially limited. Christ was clearly ignorant. But Christ was God, so Christ knows everything. Now, theologians differ about this, but I think for bad reasons. Christ was human, so Christ could sin. Could sin. I didn't say sinned, I said could. But Christ was God. It's absolutely false that God could sin. But Christ is both. Could sin, could not sin. Now you're already thinking, well, you can think of lots of ways of getting around this. One is there were really two persons. There was human Jesus and there was divine Christ. That is rejected as non-standard account of Christ. Heresies are sincere attempts to try to make sense of the apparent contradiction. But they're heresies because they mark a non-standard account. Here's another way out. Well, Christ wasn't really human, just looked human. It was just God appearing as a human. That gets around the contradiction. That too, heresy. Or the other way. Christ wasn't really God, just sort of, he was human, just sort of a representative, touched by God in ways that no other human was. That too, heresy. And remember, I'm not saying heresy bad you. I think the heresies were sincere attempts to try to get around the apparent contradiction of the incarnation. In the end, I think that the only reason theologians have run from the apparent contradiction of the incarnation is that they thought that it was logically incoherent. My view is that that is a view based on just an inadequate account of logic. As you already saw, there are very boring reasons why the standard account of logic is just a restriction. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to find in reality gluts, gaps, and all that stuff, but it's certainly logically possible. And what if the uniqueness, the radicalness of the incarnation, about which Christians all over have talked about, what if part of that very radicalness is that Christ is a unique, contradictory being in reality? Think about it this way. When the standard theology at these councils, in particular so-called Council of Chalcedon in 451, when these were written, these are people trying to, based on Scripture, trying to get the right account of the incarnation. Here's what happened. By the way, I'm not a historian, not a theologian, although your own Kent believes that everything I say is correct on this. It's not true, he doesn't. But here's what happened at these councils. They said, look, if we just say that Christ is God, we're saying something true, but it's incomplete. If we just say that Christ is human, we're saying something true, but it's incomplete. The only way to give the full truth is to say both. So they do. Even though it looks contradictory. And there was no explanation given because we have to say both to get the full truth. It looks like this is contradictory. So best just leave it at what we know we have to say. Many in theology, and all the priests at Notre Dame I've talked with, they don't like saying this is apparently contradictory. They say it's a mystery. It's a paradox. That's fine to say, but what do you mean? The only reason people are resisting this account is not because it goes against standard theology. Rather, they're doing it because they're wedded to a restricted account of logic. And it turns out they're wedded to that for no good reason. I've spent years trying to figure out if there's good reason to accept that restricted account as the full account. Maybe I just haven't found it yet. But I can tell you, I definitely have not found it yet. There's just no good reason. All right, so I promised you 12 minutes. So let me summarize where we've been. Logic, the correct account of logic is the account that applies to all true theories, covering all of reality, not just mathematical reality. there's no good argument for thinking that the standard account goes beyond mathematical reality. I mean, it may apply to other parts of reality, but there's no good argument, and there was never historically intended to be an argument, that this applies to all true theories. It looks, for reasons that we went over, like there are at least logical possibilities in which sentences might be neither true nor false, or both true and false. That's an independent matter about logic. But now, as far as theology goes, when at the core, the distinctive core of Christian theology, you have an apparent contradiction, immortal God dying, all-powerful God stubbing his toe. I mean, this is the heart of the Christian theology. And everyone says, well, it looks contradictory, but it can't be, because that would be logically incoherent. No, it's not logically incoherent. It's rare, as Christian theologians have long said. Part of the unnoticed rarity of it is that you don't see contradictory beings walking around all the time. It's a weird thing. I think in the end that there simply is no tension in God. Absolutely no tension. There's contradiction in God. There's tension in Christian theology and in Christian practice. Why? Because the reality is contradictory. It's hard to hold together. So this is the main topic of the book that I just did, The Contradictory Christ, which is an academic book, so it's not like something that you should spend your money on. Although I heard that your president is buying everyone a copy. Was that true? Did I mishear that? Okay. I also think, of course, that the other distinctively Christian doctrine, the Trinity, also involves contradiction, not in obvious ways, but I won't talk about that further now. So let me close and open it up for questions, which I would be happy to take.
Room. And,
I don't think yours is on.
There it is.
Hi, what's your name? Jacob? Go ahead.
So when we were talking about the examples, but independent from the object,
Yeah.
that at some point you're not a child. It's not like a very defined point.
Correct.
However, you can say that at 5 years old you are less of a child than you were at 1 year old, and at 12 years old you were less of a child than you were at 5, and at 18 you're less than you were at 12. So it's really more of a sliding scale, and not neither true nor false, nor is it both true and false at the same time. Same with the mountain example. You're at less of a mountain at the bottom than at the top. It's not really exactly not true or false. How would you say
I think that your point is fantastic. First, I think it's wrong, but I think it's fantastic.
In addition to that is Christ was fully human,
Yes.
fully God,
Yeah.
and not a sliding scale.
Yeah.
It wasn't like as he becomes more God, he becomes less human, and as he becomes more human.
Oh, sorry. So are you saying the same would apply then to the Christ case?
You're saying that the example is very similar to the Christ contradiction.
Yeah. Let me be clear about something. In absolutely no sense whatsoever am I saying that these weird parts of language are similar in any important or even terribly relevant way to the incarnation. It's just a simple way to see how restricted the standard account is. And so I'm not saying that what you say about the one applies to the incarnation. Let me be absolutely clear. That is not what I'm saying. But your point remains. I take it that what you're saying is truth and falsity are the limit cases of a degree theoretic property. So you don't just, a predicate isn't just true of you, or it can be, but in general, it's true to degree n. So you might have any real number between 0 and 1, and the predicate is, when it's true to degree 0, it's false to degree 1. But you can have it sort of true of you, as you get older and older, your point is child is true of you less and less. I think that's I think it's a very good idea. I think that we could rerun all of this in those degree theoretic terms and you'd be back to square one, I believe. So for example, again, this is just because they're easy to talk about. It has nothing to do with the incarnation, but consider a sentence, an analog of like the liar sentence, I'm false, or the extended one. I'm true to degree 0. It's not so you might cover the range better than the on-off, but you still at some point hit the problem. Now let's talk about theology, okay? There is a strong tradition in Christian theology that, according to which it's called a kenotic tradition, where the incarnation is not logically contradictory because God sort of poured out some of these properties of knowing everything and being all powerful and all this, and thereby became limited. And you could give a sort of degree theoretic account of that process. As a matter of fact, I actually think that somebody should give a degree theoretic account of the kenotic tradition, just to get clear on what's actually being said. But I don't think it gets around the ultimate problem. I mean, suppose that something like that is right. So it's not true that Jesus is omniscient, knows everything, only knows the stuff that wasn't poured out, right? Well, according to the core account, Jesus is still God. And God knows everything. Now, you might say in the Trinity, you say, well, that's the Father knowing it all, and the Son doesn't, or the Spirit knowing it all. But the hard nut of Trinitarian theology is that each one of them is God. And that doesn't come in a degree theoretic way. It would be an interesting theology that gave an account of it that did, actually. So you have a PhD project there. That would be fascinating. So I take your point. I think it's an excellent question. I don't think it ultimately resolves it. But one thing that we're absolutely on the same page about is the standard account is still restricted, right? Because in your account, you want to say it's ignoring all these degrees. You don't want to rule out gluts, though. Like the natural way of doing it is going to, you still have, like, if they're both 0.5, a sentence and its negation. Like, how are you going to count that? Where does truth begin? And you have to draw a line somewhere. And I think wherever you draw it, you'll get both gaps and gluts on that. But absolutely excellent question. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So I just have a specific, you don't necessarily have to answer any question because it's just a thought possibly for you and everyone. Brought up in an honors class at the university that made me recontemplate everything in life and existence. Something we also have to take into consideration, Christ was in fact God, and God is omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent. However, Christ is not omnipresent.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, Christ does not have to be omniscient at all times. And there does come a point, Christ was a child, and as an infant, he was in the tabernacle, and he was learning. If you are omniscient, you can't learn. So there was at some point that there was a realization, and one could argue that at the moment that God said, "This is my son," and the Spirit descended upon him, that omniscience or aspects of that omniscience still came to him. However, he also wouldn't have been in the garden and pleaded if everything was going to be set out in that way. And with him not being omnipresent, you can't get rid of the fact that that means he can still be God and not have those things, because as Christ, he stepped out of his glory when he came down to be a human.
Yeah, another excellent question, comment, to which I will reply, by the way. The trouble is that the standard account says Christ is divine, Christ is human. Not for part of the time Christ is divine, for part of the time Christ is human. I think the omnipresence point is a good one. My own view is that too is contradictory. I don't think that you get to have Christ being divine and human at all times during the incarnation and get around that. So your account works only if for part of the time Christ is divine. People talk of fully divine and all that. I think you can use that language. That lends itself to the sort of degree theoretic stuff. I don't think that that's actually strictly necessary. I think you're divine in the target sense or you're not. So that would be my reply. I can't see you. I hope you're not making mean faces, but thanks for the question.
Is like eternity, when say like Jesus comes back and everything, do you think that we'll have like one belief that doesn't contradict each other?
If Jesus comes back in still the sort of post-resurrection form, that sort of coming back, yeah. Yeah, I don't think these contradictions are sort of go away. I think it's part of his very being. A lot of traditions in theology think that the incarnation is contingent. I don't actually, but which means that it didn't have to happen, so it's not like absolutely essential to who Christ is. I don't have a view on that question, but on yours, I think that I think that these don't go away. I mean, if you're God and human, you have all the properties entailed by being God, and you have all the properties entailed by being human, and those properties are in contradiction. So yeah, but I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's part of because we've been so wrapped up in this restricted account of logic that we hear contradiction and we think that's a bad thing. Look, if divine reality is contradictory, it's far from a bad thing. It's just what it is. I mean, everyone says, oh, it's so hard to truly describe divine reality. Yeah, It is. And when you do it, it's contradictory. But it's not, people think, oh, if there's a contradiction, it's irrational and all this. And a lot of people sort of get raised thinking that apologetics is all about answering charges of contradiction. I just think that this is a limited sort of view. I don't think it's a bad view or anything. It's based on a misunderstanding of logic and the role of logic and all that. Contradictions, you should still not run around and embrace contradiction. You should run around and embrace the truth. And if the truth is contradictory, fine. So I would think on his return is just as contradictory. And that might sound like a bad thing, but I don't see it that way at all. It's just part of the truth. It's one of these weird cases where to get the whole truth, you have to get the negations of truths too. And actually, there's a tradition that I'm not a scholar of, but the mystic tradition. Okay, I'm going to say this. I'm not equating what I'm saying with, I don't even understand mysticism. But these people think that to really encounter the divine, you have to sort of almost bring two contradictory things together. And I think that that's probably right. I think one difficulty of believing that is that you get bounced back and forth. People sometimes talk about the humanity of Christ, and it's good that Christ understands what I'm going through because he was human and so on. And then at other times, Christ is all powerful and all knowing, and I can turn to Christ. All of it true. But rarely do you hold the two together at the same time. And that's where sort of tension comes. In us, not in the reality, if I'm right. Thanks.
So, the Bible is considered similar to Christ, where it's both man's word and both God's word. Do you think your way of viewing contradictions changes the way you read the Bible?
So let me say something on the way you frame the question and then answer the question. I would say that the Bible itself is not God's word and man's word. I know what you mean, but I don't think that, I think it's God's word written through humans. But I don't think that in itself is contradictory any more than you can get non-human things to say all sorts of things, right? So God can get humans to say all sorts of things. That in itself isn't contradictory. Does it change the way you read Scripture? Well, I mean, it opens up the space of possibilities for making sense of certain things that seem to be in contradiction. But beyond that, does it make you? Yeah, beyond that, I don't know. Did you have something in particular in mind, or?
So I was thinking of John 1, where it says, in the beginning was the Word was God, but also the Word became flesh. And so it seemed like the Word is incarnational, which kind of leads a sense to Jesus being the Word, and Jesus is both divine and human. And so in my mind, that translates to the
Yeah, the last step, the first step, yes. What I'm saying absolutely applies there. Done, yes, in an important way. That last step to the word just being the Bible, I think there's equivocation going on there that's not probably right. Yeah.
Sorry for double dipping. I just had a question. So we know that God is fully powerful, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving. And we know that God is sort of the embodiment of love. And that is something that he has to fulfill at all times, is to love us, right? That's what he does. So do you believe that it is possible that God, in order to fulfill his requirement of being love, and the definition of love being like putting yourself in someone else's shoes, that God would be able to take on flesh as a human and force himself to not be as powerful, even though he could be powerful. He has the capacity to be flying like everywhere and, being everywhere at once. But in order to fulfill his other requirement of being love, he decided not to.
Yeah, that's in many ways the sort of canonic tradition, as I understand it, is that God gave up godly qualities, becoming incarnate. The details of these accounts has never been sort of made precise enough to sort of understand exactly the implications. But I would say what I said before, which is if there's a time at which God is, that it's untrue, not true at all, that God is all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing, that would really go against the grain of Christian theology. Now, what people like to do is say, well, we're just talking about Christ, and leave the all-powerful and stuff to the Father. But the Trinity doesn't split up that way. These are distinct, but they're all God, and you can't be God without having whatever's essential to being God. And I would say it's along those lines where you're going to run into a problem. By the way, these are excellent questions. But whatever, I'm happy to stop. Sure, yeah. Stop?
I have a question.
Oh, well, sure.
Let's make this last question.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks for the last question.
No, I'll take 53 more, but no more than that. Go ahead, yeah.
So, God is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipotent. There's nothing that you can't do. So, the idea that God cannot create a rock that was too heavy for him to pick up.
Right.
So, if Jesus shares in this same divinity,
Yep.
then it is true too that he could create a rock that he could pick up that's whatever amount of weight.
Yep.
So that's his divine nature.
Right.
But we also, and if I'm following correctly, are limited understanding of this logical process. Jesus was born without sin.
Yep.
Logically, we understand that sin is our nature, so we can't relate or even fathom how that could be to be pressed but not sin. And I think that's the key note there, is that he to be able to look back at that and say, wow, like we can not sin. It is possible for us, even with the stain of sin, to be less sinful.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, and part of what your question is, okay, it'd be enough for contradictions around certain basic properties, but what about central things like sinning and so on? That goes back to the point that I talked about, that I think that there's been no real consensus around the question of Christ with respect to sin. There's absolutely firm consensus that Christ did not sin. But if Christ couldn't sin, then, I mean, why should any Christian think that Christ has gone through what they've gone through? They shouldn't. If you couldn't sin, you wouldn't. I think it's true that Christ could sin. That's part of being human. He just didn't. And that's where you get the sort of inspiration and hope that you were talking about. If he couldn't, then that's just a different, that's not human. Now again, this point is controversial, but I think theology is misstepped when theologians say that Christ couldn't sin. They do that, so there's this talk of Christology, that's an account of Christ, Christology from above and Christology from below. And there's this constant tension that theologians talk about, giving too much weight to above, saying Christ couldn't sin because Christ is God. Christ could sin because Christ is human. But all these people recognize there's a contradiction here, so they wind up tilting in one direction or the other. And I think the reality itself is contradictory. Doesn't take away from the truth. So I'm not sure if that gets to your question? Okay, good.
Let's thank Dr. Beall again. And again, we have QR code here, and I'm taking the sign-up sheets out to the table right now. Thanks for coming, everyone.